Baptiste, and I'm a professor of environmental studies as well as African and Latin American studies here at Colgate University, and that's located in Hamilton, New York. My research really focuses on the Caribbean region. I look at climate change, particularly climate change perceptions in the fishing community, both in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as in Jamaica. When we think about injustice, we're really thinking about this notion of claims that are able to be made. So, for example, Caribbean islands, can they make a claim that they are being wronged because of climate change and because of something that they have not done? And I think when we think of it within that context, we see that climate injustice manifests itself in a number of different ways in the region. The most obvious is exposure, right? And the level of impact or the level of effects that climate change have had on the island states. So we see there's greater exposure to the effects such as drought, such as hurricanes, being two of the most wide known ones. From the fishers' perspective, we see that their livelihoods have been significantly affected, both in terms of weather, but also in terms of catch. And second, it manifests itself in terms of a lack of accountability on the global level, in terms of who the perpetrators of harms are. And so here, I would ask us to consider the question of who's holding large countries like the United States, like China, those in Europe, for example, who's holding them accountable for their high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, I would say it manifests itself in terms of a lack of retribution for the harms that have been experienced by climate change. So the idea is who's funding, where is the capacity being built? Where's the support coming from for the Caribbean nations to be able to address climate change and resiliency? So I think as we think about climate justice, we really want to be able to acknowledge that there's disproportionate impact. We want to acknowledge that there are differences in vulnerability among the Caribbean island states. And we want to ensure that those Caribbean islands are part of the broader global process considered for procedural justice to be able to address the climate change and climate injustice problem. Around 2017, when you had Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma, that basically devastated a significant amount of the northeastern part of the Caribbean. And you saw the Prime Minister of Dominica coming out and clearly indicating that this is unusual, right? For you to have these two Category 5 storms within a couple of weeks of each other, devastating Puerto Rico, devastating Dominica, St. Martin, etc. You started to have that change in language and focus from just climate change being a problem to now this is about climate justice. It is about us within the region feeling the significant pinches of climate change and not being able to have the support to be able to address it. So I really think that one of the challenges is attempting to get people to use and understand the concept of climate justice as a whole, and to be able to see that the concept is relevant to the Caribbean region. So I think that it's really important for us to ensure that education is at the top of that agenda, and that we understand the terminology not from a jargony and kind of academic perspective, but really from a practical day-to-day. How does climate change impact the day-to-day life of men, women, and children within the Caribbean region, and bring that to life to individuals? Given the moment that we're living in and the critical need that we have to be able to scale back carbon emissions in order to help prevent us from going above that 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, we really do need governments and corporations to be involved. And so I'll give the example of my home country of Trinidad. and Tobago that's highly dependent on oil and gas, we have a responsibility as a nation state to be able to set the example. So, for example, how are we thinking about renewable energy for our islands? And not from the perspective of creating additional injustices, because we know that solar panels or solar farms, as well as wind farms, can create injustices in and of themselves, depending on where they're located. And the same thing I will ask of our corporations that are the major oil and gas producers within the island state, and to really be able to think about how do we as a nation state, not sit behind and jump on the bandwagon later, but how do we become leaders?